Okay, so I am here to give a lecture today. My name is Mujahid, and I am an assistant professor of epidemiology. And every time I do this lecture, I sort of feel like I have this triple whammy against me because it's early in the morning, and I understand that all of you have sort of come from, or most of you have come from biostat, right? So your brain is fried. And I mean, let's be real, we're talking about history, not the most exciting topic. So I'll do my best to spice it up a little bit, but you know, there's only so much you can do, right? Okay. So you'll see a list, okay, in any epi textbook, on any website, sort of talking about this field of epidemiology and who our founding fathers are. Fathers and mothers, I might add. But it's mostly dominated by men, and the list will look something like this. However, we're not going to spend time on all these individuals today, so I've selected a few leading men to discuss today briefly, not to say that the women didn't represent, but these are sort of the ones that you're always going to hear about, and you can read more on the others. So we all know that everything, right, is tied back to Hippocrates, right? The father of medicine, the father of epidemiology, the father of modern thought, right? Like everything that involves critical thinking, right, is always tied back to Hippocrates. But in particular, in relation to epidemiology, his published work on airs, waters, and places did provide some early epidemiologic thinking that has laid the foundation for what we try to do in epidemiology today. So in his work on air, waters, and places, he says, whoever wishes to investigate medicine properly should proceed thus. In the first place, to consider the seasons of the year and what effects each of them produces, then the winds, the hot and the cold. One should also consider most attentively the waters, which the inhabitants use, whether they be marshy or soft or hard and running from elevated and rocky situations, and the mode in which inhabitants live, and what are their pursuits, whether they are fond of drinking and eating to excess, and given the indolence and fond of exercise and labor. So what does all this mean? What is he trying to get us to do in terms of how we're thinking about disease and who gets sick and why? What is he sort of trying to challenge us to do with this statement? Consider the environment. That's a sort of leading thing that he was definitely encouraging us to do. What else? Sort of getting a more holistic, big picture of understanding disease. What else? Thinking about behaviors, right? That's another big one, right? Talking about whether individuals drink, whether they exercise, right? So he's really trying to give us a broader and more holistic account of understanding disease. So a lot of his contributions have to do with that, sort of disease as this mass phenomenon, that epidemiologic observations are important, so our person, place, and time kinds of things. He's sort of highlighting the importance of some of this, right? Time, place, the environment, health behaviors such as diet. He also was important in thinking about controlling disease. And then next, John Grant was particularly important, and he was a merchant by trade, an epidemiologist, a statistician, a demographer. Sometimes he's considered the Columbus of biostatistics. He gets a lot of names. But in particular, he collected and analyzed the bills of mortality, and these were weekly counts of deaths in London. And so he sort of was responsible for looking at these deaths and making observations around the deaths, right? So what are the leading causes? Did it vary? And so this is a table that shows you the diseases and causalities of 1832. And I have this in your handout if you all printed out the slides. I hope you can read some of them, but we're going to do a little bit of trivia, and I'm going to get some antioxidants flowing and some, what's else, flavonoids. Is that what else dark chocolate is good for? So someone tell me your best guess at what is bloody flux. Bloody flux, 348 deaths. No. Yeah, that counts, right? So the flowing of fluids. So I guess diarrhea definitely counts. Who said that? Good catch. All right. someone tell me what the leading cause of death is and what it might be? Yes. What do you think that is?
I know a lot of infants die through diarrhea. She said that also infants and
Kind of, right? So it's just dying, right? Young newborns dying, stillborn, everything kind of combined. Let's see, what's another interesting one? The cut of the stone.
Gallstones, kidney stones.
Yes. Let's see, what else? How about the king's evil? So there have been different accounts, but basically the one that I have seen most consistently is that it's an infection of the lymph nodes or throat or something like that, and that it was believed that if a king touched an individual that they could be healed of this. So that's what that one is. What about rising of the lights? That's not one of them, not stroke. Anyone else? I couldn't hear. No. So what I was able to find is that, so there's different accounts. Some believe that the light referred to the lungs. That was a common reference to the lungs back then. So it could be something like lung disease. So someone did say tumor, some kind of cancer. Did someone say that for this one, or was that another one? Okay. Sorry, no chocolate. Okay. But then they also sort of looked at who was getting the rising of the lights, and it was mostly women. So then they thought it might have something to do with women. So some things were postpartum sort of illness was suggested, preeclampsia was suggested, and that was all I could sort of find on that one. How about tympani? No. What'd you say? No. Huh? The tympani, the one that has 40 deaths. I would think that, huh? No. Any other thoughts? So that's supposed to be the swelling of a tumor, right? So something related to cancer. So not that there's any science to any of this, just a little bit of trivia. But tell me why I have the box at the bottom highlighted. What is important about that box? Okay, so he's talking about births and deaths. What else is he doing? Categorizing it, right? So births by male and female, and deaths by males and female. And then sort of all, right? So how many deaths are there in total? So this was all very, very important because no one was doing this, right? So we're looking at it, it's just like, oh, it's just a list of death and how many and some categories and some, sort of numbers by gender. And that's not novel, but back then no one was doing that. So that was very important. And it was sort of the early use of vital statistics and provided an application for how we could use vital statistics now. And some of the other early observations that John Grant made, he made observations on the high infant mortality. He made observations about the differential mortality rates based on gender, for example. He made notes about how some conditions were underreported. He made observations about sort of seasonality of disease. He also provided information on census taking, right? So of all individuals, how many died and from what condition. He made observations around urban and rural differences in disease, migration patterns, fertility rates, right? So he actually made observations about the number of male births in relation to the number of female births, so that sort of fertility ratio. And so he made a lot of important observations. His conclusions from this document is that it may now be asked, to what purpose tends all this laborious bustling and groping? To know the number of people and how many are male and female and married and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, to do this, I might answer in general by saying that those who cannot apprehend the reason of these inquiries are unfit to trouble themselves to ask them, right? So that sounds like a modern thinker, right? No one was sort of up to date on his, they couldn't handle his knowledge at the time. Yeah. I didn't look at that one. So yeah, no, I don't know. He also it receives credit for producing one of the first life tables, right? So looking at each age sort of group, the number of deaths and the number of surviving past up until that age. So that was also an important contribution. So this is just a summary. He really talked about variations in death by cause, by gender, by residence, by season, by age, acute versus chronic conditions, life tables, and then also just in demographic information, which is why he's also considered the founder of demography, because he's talking about sort of the estimates of population and rates of growth, and those other classic hallmark benchmarks of the field. So next we have James Lind, and he was a Scottish naval surgeon. He's considered as a pioneer of naval hygiene. And he published a treatise on scurvy. Does anybody know about scurvy? There you go. Vitamin D deficiency. There was also infantile scurvy because that was a big problem at that time. Symptoms included weakness, fatigue, anemia, hemorrhages, and ultimately leading on to death. And these are some images. So you can see some of the spotting of the skin. You can see the spongy gums, which is another symptom. So those are just some images. And so the problem then was that more British sailors at the time were dying from scurvy than they were from combat, and this was a problem. So it was believed to be infectious in nature, but he had this hypothesis that it might be due to moist air or that it might be due to diet. So he conducted an experiment, and in this experiment, he identified 12 scurvy patients, and he wanted to make sure that they had similar symptoms and conditions, basically that they were as similar as possible. And why might he do that? To rule out other factors. And what are these other factors called in epidemiology? Confounding, yeah, right? So he was thinking about confounding. So he created this sort of experiment where he had 6 groups, and there was only an N of 2 at the time, but hey, you do what you can do. So his results are compromised by small sample size. We won't talk about that, right? Because this is the fact that he's even conducting this experiment is groundbreaking. And so he decided to give the different groups different combinations of things. So some people received a quart of cider, some vinegar, some garlic, mustard, and horseradish. And then in the group that he observed to be fit for duty, they were given 2 oranges and 1 lemon. And so he then went on to recommend that lemon and orange extract be provided at sea. And this was adopted 40 years after his recommendation and led to the eradication of scurvy, right? So he made important contributions in terms of thinking about a hypothesis and questioning it, coming up with some kind of clinical trial or experiment to test the hypothesis, and then really trying to look at the source of disease based on person, place, and time also. And then finally, we all know this is sort of like the leading man, right? This is, sort of if you think of one person in terms of epidemiology and its founding fathers, people talk about John Snow and the Broad Street Pump, right? So John Snow was a physician and an anesthesiologist, and he is credited with conducting the first sort of comprehensive epidemiologic study. So at the time, there were significant cholera outbreaks. This one in particular was in London, and cholera was, sort of one of these diseases that really caused great concern in everyone, and there was all this sort of social commentary on the causes, right? And so the leading theory at the time was that it really was this supernatural sort of like wrath of God raining down. That's what this picture illustrates, and that was leading to sort of mass destruction among people. But John Snow believed that it was due to water contamination. And so this is just a little bit of information about cholera. It's an acute gastrointestinal disease, sort of symptoms, watery, diarrhea, severe dehydration, death as well. I believe it has a very short incubation period of about, I think something like 12 to 72 hours, something like that. So do we still have a problem with cholera currently? Haiti is an example, right? And this is from the World Health Organization. And you can see that we still have problems in certain parts of Africa in particular. And there are also sort of places where it doesn't exist. And so if there is a case, they believe it's imported from a place for which it's still a concern. Haiti sort of being this was in 2005, so that doesn't show up here. And so John Snow wanted to figure out sort of the source of this cholera outbreak, and it was in the Soho and Garden districts of London. There were 500 deaths sort of in a 10-day window. And so what he first did was to actually to sort of map it, right? So he created this map and plotted all of the deaths and sort of noticed that there was this concentration around the Broad Street pump. So imagine yourself back during this time, you have this map. What would you do next? Like, would you just say, oh, okay, it's the Broad Street pump, or what would you do?
Go there, do a field investigation and interview people and find out, are people drinking from that pump, what other sources of water, and start putting more information.
Sounds good. Oops. Ba-doom, bing. Okay. So someone else received. Oh, okay, you got it. All right. So that's exactly what he did. He went out and identified a set of cases and controls. I believe he took like sort of the first 83 deaths that occurred in the first 2-day window between August 31st and September 2nd. And basically what he did was he identified the group of cases, and those were the individuals, these are all the deaths, right? So these are all the individuals that lived near the Broad Street pump. And then he identified the controls, which were the individuals that did not live close to the Broad Street pump. And then he went and knocked on doors and asked family members for those who had died and basically tried to figure out whether or not they had any interactions with the Broad Street pump in terms of drinking the pump. And so he found that 61 actually did use the Broad Street pump of the 73 deaths that were concentrated near the pump, but 6 didn't, and there was also some missing data. And then for the individuals that were the controls, he identified that 8 of them used the Broad Street pump even though they weren't located near the pump. And then 2 didn't, and 5 preferred the water. So I guess 5 used, so of the 8, 5 preferred that water, and 3 were children who drank from that pump because it was near the school that they attended. So basically he was making these case control observations, which we now go on to sort of do all the time in terms of the case control studies that we conduct in epidemiology. He also identified the index case, which was a mother who had soaked diapers in a pail and then emptied the pail into a cistern, and that was what filtered into the pump. Yes?
So it's not really a case control study, right?
No, it's not a case control study, but it's sort of early observations in partitioning cases and controls, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about an actual case control study in a little bit. And then he went on, so he based on that sort of early work, identifying the index case and looking at the differences between cases and controls, he sort of went on. The pump ended up being removed, but he also wanted to sort of look more broadly at water sources and systems and whether or not they were leading or contributing to this cholera outbreak. So this is just sort of a table where he actually sort of looks like, what does this look like in terms of something that we talk about? Well, not exactly, because I'm thinking about it. I was going to say it looks like a 2x2 table, but it actually really doesn't, because it doesn't have exactly what we would need. But he basically is looking at the exposure, which is the treatment, the water source, right? So 3 water sources in particular here, and then he's classifying of the number of households, how many, what were the number of deaths, and then providing the sort of death rate. So this was all important. He went on to identify sort of that the epidemic follows routine routes of commerce, that it's an agent that is sort of this free living and that it multiplies within the host. He went on to make important observations about the mode of transmission being waterborne and being spread through the fecal-oral route. He also made important contributions to disease course and understanding disease course. So you start with diarrhea, sort of bloody stools, et cetera, and then leading on to death, fluid loss, leading on to death. And so, again, he's contributed with conducting the first comprehensive epidemiologic investigation. He made important contributions to sort of how, like descriptive epidemiology as well as analytic epidemiology and some of the early thinking around case control studies. He also made important contributions to the course of disease. So again, talking about the agent and the mode of transmission and the incubation period. And then he also was important in sort of providing these population-based thinking and solutions, right? So he didn't go out and tell individuals, why did you use the Broad Street pump, right? It sort of went on to lead to this removal of the pump, right? So actually doing something about it at a population level. So now we'll spend a little bit of time talking about two sort of milestones in epidemiology, and it will lead us talking about some other important figures. So this is just a figure showing this sort of epidemiological shift. And what can you see if you look at this figure, someone?
Increased death due to heart disease, cancer, decreased death due to diarrhea, pneumonia, tuberculosis.
Right. So what does that mean? What can we sort of summarize that graph to say? Yes. Right. So increase in chronic diseases and a decrease in infectious diseases. Oops. I'll get it for you. There you go. So that's sort of what this shift talks about, right? So the leading causes of death are no longer infectious in nature, and they're more chronic in nature. And this is sort of what was going on, sort of beginning in the early 1940s. And similarly, at that time, there was a problem of CVD in 1950. And so at that time, 2 out of 3 men in the U.S. developed CVD by the age of 60. It was the leading cause of death, and the etiology was poorly understood. And in particular, if you think about sort of the infectious disease era, there's always one specific agent, right, and mode of transmission, whereas now we're talking about something for which there's multiple etiology. So sort of what do you do with this? And so the Framingham Heart Study, which is still ongoing today and has evolved, there's sort of additional generational cohorts of this particular study, but the original cohort was in 1948. And they identified around 5,000 individuals, both men and women, who were between 30 and 62 years of age and had not developed sort of the symptoms of CVD or had a heart attack or a stroke. And the overall goal of the study was to identify the common factors or characteristics that contributed to CVD, and to sort of look over time in a large group of individuals who had not yet developed overt symptoms or who had not yet developed sort of had a heart attack or a stroke. And so this was some observations, some of the early results published from the study, and someone tell me what we see in this figure. Okay, in what way?
A combination in a synergistic way.
In a synergistic way? Exactly. So is there a gradient? Can someone describe the gradient that's shown in this figure? Okay. That doesn't exactly describe the gradient, though. What is the gradient about? Right, so there's this incremental increase in risk based on the number of risk factors that you have. Oops. Sorry, I should have told you to bring your heavy artillery. So what can we say about, or can we sort of provide any kind of comparison between individuals that have all 3 of these risk factors and individuals that have none? Over a 10-fold increase, right? I haven't been giving two. So, okay. The individual here in the front, the young man, he answered multiple questions. Trying to get everyone to get their antioxidants. So there's over a 10-fold, sort of about maybe a 12-fold, I guess is probably what it ends up being, increase comparing individuals that have all three versus individuals that have none. So what else would you want to know if you were to take this at face value? Excuse me? Were there any other confounding factors, and did they control for any of those factors in the study? Right, that would be something important to know. Okay. So some of the milestones of the Framing Heart study, and I didn't list the sort of principal investigators because there's too many to list, but in 1960, they made the link between cigarette smoking and increased risk of heart disease. In 61, that's when they added on cholesterol, blood pressure, and in 67, the observations around physical activity and reducing risk of heart disease. They also made observations around high blood pressure and stroke, observations around menopause and heart disease. Importantly, in 78, sort of psychosocial factors were found to affect heart disease at that time. HDL and cholesterol reducing risk due to heart disease. Obesity sort of was put on the map in 2002 as a risk factor for heart failure. And then in 2002, lifetime risk of developing high blood pressure was 9 and 10 at that time. So another important contribution is in relation to smoking. So the question is, do you remember when smoking was cool, right? Because it's interesting how things can sort of change in a lifetime. Because when I was younger, we had the cigarette candy that we used to actually smoke and eat. You remember that? And, sort of look at some of this print media, right? So more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. And you can see how distinguished the doctor looks and, sort of the movie stars and their cigarette. And you can see it's highly prevalent in children as well. It's definitely sort of a high society type of behavior. Here's another ad, do you inhale? That question gets asked a lot nowadays, really in relation to other substances. And you can see the lovely actress smoking her Camels. So smoking and lung cancer. So there were sort of some early reports about smoking and lung cancer around beginning in the 1940s. And there were sort of the first case control studies. Richard Dahl and Branford Hill are often contributed with the first case control study, but there's actually another one before that. But their particular case control study basically identified sort of this design, and you had individuals who either were cases or controls. So what does that mean, a case or a control in this case? If we're talking about smoking and lung cancer. Lung cancer, no lung cancer, right? And then the risk factor present or absent is in relation to smoking, right? And so when are you getting this information? Sort of, right? So you identify individuals that have the disease and who don't have the disease, and then you're asking them, so what are you getting? Retrospective accounts of whether or not they had the exposure or not. And so what can you think of as a problem with a retrospective account? Exactly. So sort of recall bias, right? So how will individuals recall their sort of exposure history? There's some suggestion that individuals who are diseased or who are sick have better recall because they're sort of really agonizing over what happened and why and what they did, et cetera, right? But regardless, this was sort of a great first step at looking at this problem, and particularly because lung cancer was rare, and to sort of follow people over time. Well, I'll talk about that in a minute, so we'll just stop here. So they conducted this case control study. They enrolled cases and controls, so there were 709 cases and 709 controls, and then they interviewed the cases and controls to find out these information on a variety of different things, right? So whether they had smoked, the age at which they started smoking, sort of their smoking patterns over time, the mode of smoking in terms of whether it was cigarettes or pipes. They also asked about how much they smoked per day. And they compared cases to control with respect to these different characteristics that they were able to ascertain data on. And so in the first table, we have the proportion of smokers and non-smokers in patients with lung cancer and a set of controls without lung cancer? And what can you see based on the observations provided in this table, or this sort of summary of information in this table? A lot more men what? In the study. There's a lot more men, yes. What else? What can we say about those numbers? Doesn't have to be formal, just, I mean, what would you say if you just saw these numbers and you saw that for non-smokers, right? So basically you have at the top, you have the number of non-smokers. Very few non-smokers with lung cancer, and what else? Hmm?
Well, the ratio of, it's the ratio of lung cancer to, I don't know what you mean by diseases other than cancer, but the ratio of lung cancer to the non-lung cancer category is 15, it's 1 to 15. So basically, the incidence of lung cancer among the control group is relatively small compared to whatever the other category is.
Right. So the prevalence, because we actually can't speak to incidence yet because it's not a, what kind of study? Cohort study. So you guys will get into all of this over the semester. But yeah, so basically you can sort of make some comparisons, and you guys are going to learn about the measures of association, disease association that you can calculate from different kinds of study. So you could calculate an odds ratio from the data that's provided and to quantify sort of an increased odds among smokers compared to non-smokers in terms of their lung cancer prevalence. Yes?
I think it's really interesting in the female non-smokers, there's a higher rate of cancer, more than double, than males. It kind of is the beginning, would look like the beginning of identifying secondhand smoke as a risk factor.
Yeah, that's interesting too, and I don't know that they actually made any early sort of statements in sort of their early writings. That would be interesting to look at to see if they, yeah, absolutely. So then they have this sort of figure here, and what can we sort of say about this particular figure? So this is looking at the percentage of patients. We have controls and cases, right? So those individuals with disease being lung cancer, those individuals without disease, and on the x-axis we have the amount of tobacco smoked daily. So what jumps out? So every sort of for every grouping of the amount of smoke, right? So the amount of tobacco daily, they're comparing disease and non-disease in terms of the proportion of individuals, right? So for those individuals that smoke none, you can see the proportion with disease and not. For those individuals that smoked 1 to 4 cigarettes, the proportion of disease and not. So what can we say here? Why do I have those two numbers circled?
Is this following the same group over from age 0 to 3?
No, that's not age. That's the number of cigarettes smoked per day. Kind of. Say that another way. Say it in terms of comparing those individuals with disease and without disease in terms of the number of cigarettes smoked per day.
The ratios shift, right? I mean, as you go from having a very low amount of smoking, you're going to have a greater proportion of people without disease than with, and then as soon as we get into these higher numbers, you start to see like a reverse proportion.
Right. So if you look at the individuals who are smoking a great deal per day, you can see that the overall percent of having lung cancer is much higher, right? So you see 23 versus only 11% without. But what is the problem with this? So why can't we say in this case smoking causes lung cancer? Like, what's problematic with this data?
Well, because not smoking itself doesn't seem to be what's causing cancer, right? Because people are smoking 5 to 14 cigarettes a day, and there are more people without cancer than with. But when you get high doses of smoking, so 25 to 49 or more than 50 cigarettes a day, that's when you start to see that smoking seems to be related to cancer, but it's at such a high amount that you can't really say that smoking is what causes cancer.
Right. So, so part of the problem is the way that the data is collected and the way that it's being summarized in terms of being able to say, so individuals who smoke are not going to get lung cancers, right? That's the first problem. The second problem is this is a case control study, so that means that you're asking individuals to go back in time and to recall their smoking patterns, right? So what is really important in terms of really being able to say that something caused something else? Which came first, right? That's really, really important. I haven't been following through very well. Sorry, I've been forgetting. But anyways, right, so we need to make sure that the smoking came first and then the individuals went on to develop lung cancer. And we can't we can sort of assume based on the recall, but we don't actually know, right? And then we also have to question how well we control for other explanations, right? So there's been some, like the famous case of coffee causing lung cancer. And so there were some studies that actually produced an association between drinking coffee and developing lung cancer. So why do you think that is? Right, because smokers drink more coffee. And so it really wasn't about the coffee, it was about this being sort of this proxy for cigarette smoking. And that's the reason why you ended up having this increased risk. So there are all kinds of problems with this particular study. And so they went on to conduct the first cohort study. And the difference between the case control and the cohort study is that in the cohort study, you actually identify individuals that smoke and those that don't, and then you follow them over time to look at the development and onset of disease, right? In this case, lung cancer. So their cohort study was conducted in 1951, and they identified around 6,000 individuals that were members of the British Medical Association, and they also sort of had males and females, and they followed individuals for over 25 years. And based on this kind of follow-up, they were able to identify that smokers were 10 times more likely to die of lung cancer than non-smokers. Okay, so you're going to get into more of the details around case control versus cohort studies and the measures of association that you can calculate from each of these kinds of studies. But this is sort of some of the early work in conducting a case control and in conducting a cohort study. In this case, to produce the evidence that we currently have on the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Yes?
In the previous study, were all the people the same age?
No. So would that be a problem?
Could be.
Why?
Age will affect the health of their organs.
Okay.
Lungs or heart. And
So age would be associated with getting lung cancer because you have to be a certain age to get lung cancer. And what else is age associated with? Is it associated with smoking?
smoking longer.
Smoking longer. And there's also an association with age in terms of actual smoking as well. So that means that age would be a confounder. That's all I'm getting at. So right, it does matter. And individuals are never of the same age, but there's ways in which we can match individuals on age or control for age in our analytic approach. And you guys will learn more about that as well. So the results from this particular study went on to be very influential in the Surgeon General report on smoking and lung cancer. So that milestone sort of ended there. And the other important thing to note, I would say, about sort of the case of smoking and lung cancer is that we're still conducting all these studies currently, right? Because we're identifying secondhand smoke, and we're actually even onto thirdhand smoke now, and sort of really trying to understand the true pathophysiology between how exactly smoke, sort of leads to lung cancer. Like, is it oxidative stress? Is it, sort of all these things? But we didn't know that then, right? But did that prevent us from taking action? No, right? So sometimes you can sort of go data crazy and continue and continue to sort of mine data and continue to investigate a particular problem, but you have to sort of take a step back and think about when is action appropriate. And in the case of smoking and lung cancer, I would argue that it was very early on, sort of after sort of a couple of classic cohort studies by which we started taking action. So with that, I'll end and I'll welcome any questions at this time. Yes?
Why did they use as case control study people who had some lung disease rather than people who had no lung disease?
What do you mean?
In the control for it was lung cancer versus people who had no lung cancer but they had some other lung disease.
I'm trying to see what you're talking about. Yeah, no, they were patients with. They also had patients who had other diseases and cancers, and basically they were just looking at one point in time, they looked at sort of the fact that smoking caused an elevated risk of other things as well, right? Well, not risk, but there was a higher prevalence of other things as well. So this was sort of some of the early thoughts around, and the Framingham study actually did a better job of actually identifying smoking as a risk factor for example, cardiovascular disease, but they also sort of just wanted to look at disease more generally to see the risk of smoking.
It just looked like the controls were patients and not people who were not patients with disease.
Well, the controls were patients because that was the method that they were using to detect, to enroll people into the study. So that's why they were just trying to make sure that they didn't have lung cancer, but the chances that they didn't have anything, there's sort of going to be a fewer set of patients who have nothing. So they're going to have something. So that was their way to sort of to identify their controls. But there's actually a lot of issues around how you identify controls and the appropriate set of controls. And so you guys are going to spend a lot of time talking about that as well, sort of options for identifying your control set in a case control study. Yes?
What would you say is one of the the bigger milestones in our current time in terms of public health or epidemiological standpoint of view? Like, what are some of the ways?
To me, it's those things that have led to policy in some kind of way. And so I can think of examples in relation to seatbelt use, right? So there's a lot of work around seatbelt use and policies and, sort of mandating seatbelt use. There's also been a lot of important work in the area of maternal and child health in terms of endorsing breastfeeding. And so the area that I'm in, I'm a social epidemiologist. And I look at how social factors affect health outcomes. And so one social factor that I'm particularly interested in is neighborhood environments and how, in fact, sort of where you live and opportunities where you live. So whether or not there's opportunities for physical activity or whether there's availability of healthy foods and how that impacts certain chronic disease, in particular cardiovascular outcomes. And so the CDC is currently working with the USDA, and they've identified across the country all of the areas that are considered food deserts. Those are areas for which there's no supermarket within a 10-mile radius and for which it's a low-income environment, so that you would assume that individuals aren't as mobile in order to get to a supermarket. And they're working to subsidize these communities so that they can get healthier food options. And so that's examples of how, sort of documenting these associations have sort of gone on and led to policy or led to sort of some kind, even if it's at a local scale. And there's millions more examples like that, but those are sort of the ones that come to mind at the top of my head. Yes? Cigarettes. So what this is saying is that among individuals that have lung cancer, 3% or 5%, I guess it is, smoked 50 or more cigarettes per day, as compared to individuals who do not have lung cancer. There were actually still 2% that smoked that many cigarettes per day. So that's what that's saying. That's why it's sort of, so there's a lot of ways in which you can make decisions around displaying the data. And this is a little bit confusing because it's actually looking among the cases and among the controls, sort of the proportion. So that's why. Yeah. Okay. So next week, on Wednesday, I'm going to be back, and I'm going to be talking about ethics So hopefully it's a little bit more exciting because we have a lot of examples across the world in terms of this. Oh, more chocolate. I'll bring more chocolate. Absolutely. You might need to bring your, your helmet and all that. But yeah, so I'll see you guys on Wednesday.